Good evening, everyone. I'm Chavator Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. As you've heard me probably in previous events, you know that Jewish Studies at ASU offers undergraduate courses as well as a very robust program in public education to the public at large. We do so from an interdisciplinary perspective. We try to combine all aspects of the Jewish experience, history, philosophy, religious studies, comparative literature, psychology, and so forth. And we really believe that education is something that we engage throughout life. So it's a lifelong commitment. And we try to do so. We try to make it available to the public by giving those lectures on Zoom as much as possible. We've been very fortunate to host Professor Gary Rendsburg of Rutgers University for a lecture series under the title of 1,000 Years of Jewish History. And if you've been with us before, you know that his first two lectures, one on November 14, one on November 21st, were simply fabulous. They were very informative, they were accessible, they were beautifully presented. And those lectures introduced us to the emergence of Jewish diasporas. First, the diaspora in Babylonia and Egypt after the fall of the first temple, and then the diaspora in the Roman Empire, especially after the fall of the second temple. This evening, we're going to hear more about the Jewish diaspora, if we can call it. I'm not sure it's a proper word. We will learn more, but about Jewish life in Arabia in the pre-Islamic period. So very briefly, a quick summary of Professor Rendsburg's career. He is currently the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish History at the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He also has an appointment in the History Department at Rutgers. He earned his MA and PhD in Hebrew Studies from New York University in New York. He taught at Canisius College in Buffalo and then at Cornell for 18 years, and he joined Rutgers in 2004. He's the author of 6 books, over 200 scholarly articles, and he covers a whole range of related topics that engage literary approaches to the Bible, the history of the Hebrew language, the history of ancient Israel, the relationship between Egypt and ancient Israel, the Dead Sea Scroll, and even he gets into the medieval period where he talks about medieval Hebrew manuscripts. So among the books, if you want to make sure that you have some of his books in your library, take a look at his oldest book, I believe, and the Bible and the Ancient Near East. That's from 1997. Then another book is on the Song of Songs. The title is Solomon's Vineyard, Literary and Linguistic Studies in the Song of Song. And a book that probably would be of interest to many people in the audience is How the Bible Was Written. That's from 2019. And it explains the nexus between language and literature in the Hebrew Bible. So he's also an archaeologist. And you know that if you joined us in the last 2 lectures, we learned an awful lot about ancient life from archaeology. So Professor Rendsburg, the screen is yours, and we're all ready to learn about the Jews of Arabia.
And thank you again, Chava. It's been a pleasure to be together for the first 2 sessions back in November. We took a week off for the Thanksgiving weekend, and now we're back this evening for the 3rd and final lecture. And I also just want to acknowledge Lisa Kaplan behind the scenes, because so many logistical issues have to be planned and carried out to make sure that these lectures proceed successfully. So thanks to everybody at the ASU Jewish Studies program. It's just been wonderful to become part of your family this November, December. So right, the last 2 2 and 3 weeks ago, we talked about Jewish diasporas that were probably pretty well known to most people. Whether you knew the details or not, but most people who know ancient history know that Jews lived in Babylonia and they lived in Egypt, and they moved into the Mediterranean, and there were Jews in Rome and Italy generally. Today I'm going to present a topic which is little known, not just to the public at large, but even scholars of Jewish history know so little about what I'm going to show, mostly because it's such new material. Standard textbooks, including the one that we actually use at Rutgers to teach the Jewish History Survey courses, do not mention the material that I'm going to show you this evening. So with that as introduction, let's proceed and learn about the Jews in Arabia from the Great Revolt until the rise of Islam. So here's the map of the Roman Empire, which we actually showed 2 weeks ago as well. And you see Judea in the far eastern extreme of the Roman Empire. And as most people know, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, you have the Great Revolt of the years 66 through 73, which results in the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. 2 generations later, there's another revolt known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, which to some extent was even more disastrous. The Romans quashed that rebellion as well. And you may say, well, it could be more devastating than the loss of the temple. And the answer is that after this second revolt, the Romans essentially made Jerusalem off limits. They were tired of having to put down Jewish military uprisings, and so Jews began to find new homes. In the land of Israel, which we didn't talk about at all, barely during these 3 lectures, although we'll come back to it at the very end, Jewish life reestablished itself in the northern part of the country, in the Galilee. And as we talked about 2 weeks ago, at the last lecture, Jews went east to the Euphrates, and they went west into the Mediterranean, even to Rome itself. But there was another option. And if you look at the map, it's not that very far away. And that option was to go into the Arabian Peninsula. So let's look at the places. This is a very detailed map. The map's in French, but it doesn't cause many problems. But I use it because it gives you so many place names. And we're going to be looking at 2 particular areas within the Arabian Peninsula. In the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, modern-day northwestern Saudi Arabia, there are 3 oasis sites that we're going to be looking at: Tema, Al-Hijr, and Dedan. In the far southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, which is more or less modern-day Yemen, as you can see, there's lots of information here on the map. There is a kingdom called Himyar, and we'll talk about the Jews at those 3 northern oasis sites, and we'll talk about the Jews in Himyar as well. Now, in between these two boxes are the cities of Mecca right here and Medina right here, so prominent in the Quran. We'll come back to those again at the very end. Now let's begin in that northwestern Arabia region. I think goes without saying, but I will state it regardless, that I have never been to Arabia, but I have traveled in southern Jordan on several occasions, and the terrain looks very similar. In fact, I basically peered into Saudi Arabia because it's just across the border. And in fact, if you've ever been to Eilat, at the very southern tip of Israel, you can see Arabia in the distance as well. And it's just one huge, vast, empty wasteland. These are just some photos that I picked up from the internet or a colleague gave me, and you can see it's just emptiness. Now, amidst that emptiness are some oasis sites. So here's Eilat. Here's southern Jordan. If you've ever been to the Wadi Rum, you've been very close to Saudi Arabia. This is the modern political boundary, but of course they don't exist in antiquity. And as you head south, you come to the 3 sites that you see here. Tema, these are their modern names. Tema, both ancient and modern. And then Madain, Salah, and Al-Ula are the modern place names. So we begin with the oasis of Tema. And you can see there's palm trees everywhere. There is a natural spring which allows for the greenery that you see. And there are archaeological ruins there because there was a city there back in the later Roman period. So some more photos of what Tema looks like. Now, there's that, the spring has been controlled by a huge, I'd love to go see this one day, by a huge man-built enclosure so that all the water remains intact, and at certain periods it'll be much higher than you see here. And at the top of this, you see all these water wheels. I don't know how old this thing is. Obviously, this doesn't go back to the period we're talking about, 1500, 1800 years ago, but it gives you a sense of how a city can prop up around a natural spring, even in the desert. Now, the first piece of Jewish information that we get from this region is dated to 203 CE. It is a memorial inscription on stone. The language is Aramaic. The script is the Nabatean alphabet. The Nabateans used both Arabic and Aramaic. They may have spoken Arabic, but they wrote in Aramaic because there was no real Arabic writing tradition yet around the year 200. And it's the same 22-letter alphabet as Hebrew or the Aramaic that you may know. One-to-one correspondence between the letters. So this actually begins here with Dalet Aleph and so on. Here you have a memorial plaque. Look at the names. Isaiah and Yosef, and then a third name, Amram, which we know from the Bible, the father of Moses, and the fourth name, Ashmu, which is not identifiable as Jewish. So it's a memorial plaque. Somebody named Isaiah died, and his brothers put up this memorial plaque, and then it is dated. And we can date it specifically because of that date. It comes out to 98, but you add 105. In the year 105, the Nabatean region was incorporated into the Roman Empire, and they began to use that mark, calendrical mark, to fix their own chronology. So the year 98 is, in fact, the year 203 CE. If you've been to Petra, that is one of the great cities of the Nabateans. So the Nabateans in that period, in the late Roman period, are in southern Israel. There are Nabatean sites in the Negev, such as Avdat, in southern Jordan, most famously Petra, and into northern Arabia. So here you have the first Jewish inscription. Now, what's striking is that our individual, Isaiah, the son of Yosef, is called the chief counselor of Tema. And the syntax this happens frequently in Hebrew and Aramaic and so on. Not clear whether the chief citizen, and the term there is Reish. I've put that into the Hebrew or Aramaic letters that you may be able to read. In Hebrew it would be Rosh, but in Aramaic it's Reish. Is it Isaiah or Yosef, his father, was chief citizen, something like mayor of the place. Now, if a Jew was already serving as the chief citizen or mayor of Tema in 203 CE, almost undoubtedly this individual did not arrive there in 200 or in 190 or in 180. Most likely he is the son or grandson of people who moved to Tema. We know the patterns of migration. The first generation comes, and they don't typically serve in the government, but a second generation or third generation may, and of course we see that all over even our own country with the children of recent immigrants or grandchildren of recent immigrants serving in government positions. So that's the pattern I want you to think about here. If that's the case, it's very possible that this family is amongst those who migrated to the region in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, or maybe even before that, as conditions in the land of Israel began to deteriorate. So think about these things as I mention them. And this is probably near the start of my talk, a great place to quote to repeat the well-known quote of the great American Jewish historian Jacob Rader Marcus. I wish we were all together in real time so I could hear you laugh when I say this. Marcus of HUC Cincinnati, who lived to be 100 and chronicled American Jewish history, but also prior to that medieval European history, famously said, "The first Jews in a place were greeted by the Jews already there," which is to say, These are the first Jews that we know of, but needless to say, there were Jews prior to our friends Isaiah and Yosef and Amram and Ashmu coming to the site. Okay, the first Jews in a place were greeted by the Jews already there. There are very few instances in Jewish history, like the Jews arriving in New Amsterdam in 1654, where we know they are the first ones. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about the Jews in Cologne, Germany. The first time we have a reference to them is 321, and they're serving on the city council, right? If I quoted that 2 weeks ago, I get to quote it again now. So this is the map, and you can see how they would move into that region. Now, slightly further south, you see the map there on the bottom right, is another oasis site called Al-Hijr in antiquity, Madain Salih in Arabic today. And this looks like Petra, if you've been to Petra. These are these sandstone cliffs, and built into the mountainsides are these very, very large tombs. In fact, Saudi Arabia right now, as we speak, is developing this area for tourism. They're expecting large numbers of tourists. May we only have peace in the Middle East so that it's safe to travel into these places. Now, here as well, archaeologists have found inscriptions which can be associated with Jewish individuals. In this case, we have a person with the name of Adyon, a name that we don't know necessarily from Jewish sources, but he's the son of Choni, the son of Samuel, and those are names which, of course, are connected to the Jewish tradition. Samuel, famously from the Bible, Choni, famously from rabbinic literature. And this person is the chief citizen of Hadra, the place we're talking about right now. And this family married into the family of the Jews of Tema. So they're all interconnected at a distance of not too many miles from one another, once again serving in high positions of government, chief citizen, in this case, Resh, spelled Resh Yud Shin. There's a sundial at Hadra, now in the Istanbul Museum, and on it, at the bottom here, it says Menashe bar Natan Shlam. Again, it's in Aramaic, although Nabatean script. Manasseh, the son of Nathan, Shlam, Aramaic for shalom, peace. This must have been a wealthy individual. It's hard to date this, but from the same general time period. This must have been a wealthy individual who provided the funds for the town sundial. Probably was displayed in a prominent plaza or piazza in the town. Now, this is what it looks like today. You can see that the terrain is as rugged and empty as you could imagine. But again, there's a spring there, so look at all the greenery. And up here in the upper right is the old town of Dedan. I'm sorry, we've moved now to the third site. And you can see the site of Dedan, the old site here, but the modern town of Alula has spread in this valley, and this is only 14 miles or 22 kilometers south of the previous site. This is the old site, now totally abandoned. Not that it goes back to the period we're talking about, 16, 1700 years ago, but these were the most recent houses of the Bedouin in the region, or those who had settled down, probably from former Bedouin or with Bedouin roots. But it gives you a sense of how a modern city now has developed, and this is totally abandoned, but you can see these houses from that time period. Once again, cliffs and tombs built into the cliffs, and this entire rock side has all manner of inscriptions. Some of them much more recent, as you see here, because they're in Arabic, but some of them relatively old, very hard to date. There's no carbon-14 text that you can do on somebody carving into a rock, but we can usually tell by the language or the script. First of all, lovely picture of an ostrich and what probably is an ostrich egg and a desert fox. Aren't these all wonderful? And then you see some older Semitic alphabetic material here. Now, how do we know all this? More than 100 years ago, these two Dominican priests, Raphael Savignac and Antonin Jossin, OP means, it's French, but it's equivalent, or Latin, but it's equivalent of Order of Preachers, and that's the symbol of Dominican priests. They were associated with the École Biblique in Jerusalem. The École Biblique, which you see here on the right, is the preeminent center for biblical research in Jerusalem, run by the Dominicans. They have the best library by far for the field of biblical studies, even better than the National Library of Israel, because it was founded in 1890, long before the NLI in the more modern part of Jerusalem. This is just outside the old city walls in East Jerusalem, a wonderful place. Savignac and Jossin, can you imagine doing this around 1910? They went out into the desert and they wanted to see the archaeology of Arabia. Amongst the people they met, by the way, during World War I was Lawrence of Arabia. Here is a photo of Jossin and T.E. Lawrence, who's most famous for his engagement in foreign affairs during World War I, but was also an archaeologist both before and after the war. These are the books that these two French Dominican priests published regarding their archaeological mission to Arabia. And you see the first volume on the left, From Jerusalem into the Hejaz, that's the name of the region, to Madain Salah, which I showed you. And then in the middle volume, Hedra and Tema, which I showed you, and further inscriptional material that I'm not sharing with you, nothing particularly Jewish in them. But those three sites all have Jewish inscriptions. Now, the ones that I've shown you so far are relatively new ones, those memorial plaques, but these are still there in the wall, carved into those walls, and they were copied by Jossin and Savignac, and in their volumes, this is in volume 2, they collated all the Hebrew manuscripts, they numbered them 1 through 8, Hebrew inscriptions, numbered them 1 through 8. They're Hebrew in script, but they are not necessarily Hebrew in language. In fact, these are the earliest Judeo-Arabic inscriptions that we possess. Now, we think of Judeo-Arabic as the language of the Jews living in the Islamic period. So, for example, luminaries, Sa'adja Gaon and Maimonides, I mean, those would be the two largest luminaries. When they wrote their philosophical treatises, they wrote in Arabic, but they wrote in Hebrew letters. And so that's what you're looking at here. This is Arabic, but Hebrew letters. And they were restudied recently by my colleague Simon Hopkins of the Hebrew University. These are still from centuries before the rise of Islam. So inscription number 1 says Naim ben Ishaq, if you can read the Hebrew. Now, Naim and Ben are perfectly good Hebrew names, fine. But Ishaq is the Arabic way of pronouncing Yitzchak. In other words, if this were pure Hebrew and this were Isaac, this would be a Yod and this would be a Tzadi. But in Arabic, it's Ishaq, which is what you get here. Number 2, Barech Elohim, bless God. You couldn't tell whether that's Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic. Fine. This one here, number 4, actually, let me go to number 8. V'chatav, and he wrote, and the name of this person is Ismail ben Sadok, Ishmael, the son of Sadok. Same thing. In Hebrew, it's Yishmael with a Yud and a Shin. In Arabic, it's Ismail with an Aleph and a Samech. And so they're writing their Hebrew/Arabic names out in Hebrew letters, but per the Arabic pronunciation. And inscription number 4, as Simon Hopkins has interpreted, and I agree with him, this is not El Alam, like unto eternity, which is how some scholars originally read it, and then the name of the person, Shmuel, Samuel. This is the Arabic word El Alam, Al-Alam rather, which means the teacher or the master. That's what this means. And his name was Samuel. And those are the inscriptions on those walls, natural cliff walls. Some more recent explorations have uncovered yet more material. And again, you take a guide and you just go out in your Jeep and you begin to look. Now, in the region of southern Jordan and northern Arabia are these stone natural things everywhere. And you just walk around And I know several of my colleagues who have done this, and they just look and find inscriptions. Nowadays, you can photograph them and then copy them and so on, and that's what these scholars are doing, including my colleague Ahmad Al-Jalad of Ohio State University, who is a Jordanian American and speaks fluent Arabic, and he goes off into these regions and he starts looking at these rock inscriptions, right? And this is what you get. And here is a Jewish one. Now, he actually didn't discover this one, but he has published on it. A French colleague discovered it. And I've taken the letters that you can see in the photograph, and because it's a one-to-one correspondence between those letter shapes and the Hebrew Aramaic alphabet that you may be familiar with, I've put them here for you in the script that you should be able to read if you can read. And it's Aramaic, and it says, may Sholai, the son of Ausho, be remembered in goodness and in peace, bitav vishalam, ushlam, bitav ushlam, in goodness and in peace, min kedam mare alma, before the Lord of the world. Well, that's about as monotheistic a statement as you can get. The names do not disclose their Jewishness per se, but when you refer to God as Mare Alma, Aramaic for Lord of the world, it's actually the equivalent of the Hebrew expression Adon Olam. And if that weren't Jewish enough for you, the inscription goes on to tell you that he wrote this on the day of the festival of Matzot, Hag al-Patir, Hag meaning festival, al the Arabic definite article, and patir, the Aramaic word for unleavened bread. So we obviously have some Jew out in the middle of nowhere, right, southeast of the land of Israel, writing an inscription on this piece of stone. And it gives us the ability to date it again, 197. And so we now are looking at a date of Ad 105, about 302 CE. I hope everybody's enjoying this. I hope you're getting everything that we're referring to here and how remarkable these discoveries are. So that's that region of Northwest Arabia in the 3 oasis sites and here and there on the roadway out in basically what is the middle of nowhere. Now let's move south to Yemen, where we actually have even more material. So the kingdom of Himyar begins in the far south of the Arabian Peninsula, and it was, you see it in the red, it was a Jewish kingdom. Now, you may just be shocked to hear this if you don't know this. This is what I said at the outset. People simply have no knowledge of this. Around the year 380 CE, the king of Himyar and the royal family converted to Judaism, and along with them, apparently, a large number of Jews. Now, there clearly must have been Jews in the region already, for how else would they even have known about Judaism? So further north in the Arabian Peninsula, we have evidence for Jews at this time period. Now, we don't have evidence for Jews here, except we do, as you'll see. We don't have evidence for Jews like from 300 or earlier 200, but they must have been there by the late 4th century. Otherwise, how would the king even know about such things? And their most famous king is Yusuf, Arabic for Joseph, who rules towards the end of the history of his kingdom in the 500s. Now, why would anybody convert to Judaism? By the way, if you know anything about Jewish history, you'll know the medieval kingdom of the Khazars in modern-day southern Russia converted to Judaism. So that would be another instance of that. But this is an example of that about 500 years. This is an example of the same phenomenon about 500 years earlier. Now, Christianity had spread to what is today Ethiopia and Eritrea. In the green, you see the kingdom of Aksum. Christianity came through Egypt, up the Nile into Ethiopia or down the Red Sea. And so the Christians established a kingdom there of Aksum with the port of Adulis. These two peoples on either side of the Red Sea were constantly at odds with one another, including military fighting and naval battles, because each one wanted to have control of the very crucial sea trade, right, along the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandab, this very small strait, and out into the Indian Ocean. So anybody who controlled this region was able to collect the tariffs and so on. So it's very possible, it is hypothesized that the royal family of Himyar, with its capital in Safar, you see where that is, converted to Judaism because they learned that the people on the other side had converted to Christianity or had become Christians, and they knew that there was another monotheism available to them. Or they were just attracted to Judaism. You see Sana'a, which is the modern day capital of Yemen. The kingdom of Himyar would spread northward and eastward, and in fact it would eventually incorporate Najran to the far north, which is actually in Saudi Arabia of today, north of the modern border with Yemen. And it goes without saying, it's one of the most dangerous places in the world, that I have never been to Yemen either, where battles continue, even if they don't get the publicity that other hotspots in the region receive. What does anybody do in that part of the world, by the way? A large portion of their GNP, to use a modern economic term, comes from myrrh and frankincense. These trees grow only there and nowhere else. And all of the great cultures of the Near East and the Mediterranean required myrrh and frankincense in their temples. The Bible mentions it in connection with the tabernacle and then later on with Solomon's temple. And we know that the Jews were importing it throughout the biblical period. But the Egyptians needed it, the Babylonians needed it, eventually the Greeks and the Romans, they were all in need of myrrh and frankincense. I hate to say such a thing, but it's true. The temples were sacred places to their devotees, but they were also slaughterhouses where animals were being killed on a daily basis and slaughtered on the altars and being offered to the different deities. And that smells a lot. And the incense was required at first probably for simply logistical or practical purposes to make the place smell better, and then eventually gets ritualized. So as we know from the Torah, you have to have a small altar for the incense. And where were they going to get it? They were going to get the myrrh and the frankincense from southern Arabia. And that trade had to be controlled either by caravans on the Arabian side of the peninsula or maritime trade on the Red Sea. And here are some photos of those wonderful, sweet-smelling plants. So this will be the kingdom of Himyar at its greatest extent, from its capital at Safar. Now let's look at some of the archaeological material. General view of the excavations of that site. And here you have one of the earliest inscriptions dated to January of 384 CE, which commemorates the building of the palace for the king. And it says, I'll say something about the script in a moment and the language. It says, with the support of their Lord, the Lord of the sky. Now, if that's all we had, we probably wouldn't just say it's Jewish, but we have so much more that we know it's Jewish. Everybody in the ancient world worshiped multiple deities, and that was certainly the case in Arabia and southern Arabia as well. And we know the names of the polytheistic deities of the region. So when you see something as simple as the Lord of the sky, or the single the Lord, this becomes a monotheistic proclamation, as it were. In a few moments, you'll see references to Jews and Israel and so on. So this is how we know we're looking at a Jewish royal family right here. Now, the language is called generically South Arabian, and more specifically Sabaic. By the way, this is the area where the Queen of Sheba came from. The Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon more than 1,000 years prior to this, 1,300 years prior to this, Sheba is the same as Sabah. So the Sabaic language is what you're looking at here in a particular Sabaic alphabet. And it's alphabetic, so I can transcribe it there on the bottom of the text box, and I'll continue to do that throughout. And sometimes just transfer it into Hebrew letters as well. Now, this is the longest inscription that we have from this region, and it is absolutely remarkable. It actually refers to a man named Judah near the start. It mentions his people of Israel, And here you see I have transcribed these terms into Hebrew letters, and it mentions the synagogue. Now, the big things that you see right, left, and center are monograms. This is very typical of these South Arabian inscriptions. So these are, letters that get, shown real large to give you, to direct your eye and, have your attention go to them. And it says along the way, again, the Lord of life and death, the Lord of the sky and the earth, right? We're talking about a single deity here. In a polytheistic environment, you'd have a god of death, you'd have a sky deity, you have an earth deity. Right here, it's the one God who created everything, and then at the very end, you see the mention of his people, Israel. That's his people, Israel, right there. Sa'avhu Yisrael. And there you just gives you some sense of what the alphabet looks like. Now, to the monogram. Inside the center monogram, and you may be able to see it on this image, but I'm going to blow it up for you on the next one, different photographers, so we have different coloration. Inside that large monogram are Hebrew letters. If you can read it, I have it in the text box for you as well. Katav, Yehuda, Zachor Latov, Amen, Shalom, Amen. Katav, Yehuda, Zachor Latov, Amen, Shalom, Amen. I really do wish we were in person. I know Zoom is so wonderful. I'd love to see the gobsmacked faces, jaw-dropping faces. You mean to tell me that 1600 years ago, Jews were writing Hebrew graffiti on a South Arabian Jewish inscription? And the answer is yes. So our friend Yehuda, who put this up, when he died, somebody incised into the center of this a piece, the writing that you see here. And yes, that's not a typo in the text box. A singular graffiti is called a graffito. Remember, we're talking Italian here. So this is a Hebrew graffito at the center of this inscription. More such inscriptions commemorating the building of another king. We're now into the 5th century with the assistance of their people, Israel. Okay, Sa'ab Hamu Yisrael. I mean, these are just phenomenal inscriptions. And again, God is referred to as the God of heaven and earth, putting this into Hebrew letters. The nun that you see, the final nun, is the definite article. But if we just leave that off for a moment, El, Baal, Shemain, Wa'ard, the God of the El, the God of the Lord of heaven and earth. Another one for another palace by yet another later king, with the support of their Lord Rahmanan. Rahmanan meaning the merciful one, and that will become an epithet of Allah eventually in the Arabic Islamic tradition. Again, the Lord of the sky and the earth, a single deity. These are all Jewish inscriptions. Again, you see some of the large monograms here. Monograms, sorry. At Safar, there are these rock-cut chambers with stairs going down. They have been identified as mikvaot. There is no other explanation for these. Again, especially knowing that this was the capital of the Jewish kingdom. This is just some diagram, which my ability to think mathematically is not always so clear, but you can see somebody has created the water level and the bedrock and the floor in this diagram, and showing you the staircase here. Above it today, I don't think it's in existence because it's just an archaeological site, but above it was built a mosque, and they're showing you, something about the mosque, X number of meters above bedrock, and even showing you the Qibla, which is the direction to Mecca. So this is all above these mikvah installations that you see here. If we go to the another site, further north of Sana'a, again, God is referred to as Lord of the sky, God of Israel, and then it breaks off, but at the beginning of the next line, which would be down here, it's broken. You can obviously restore the rest of the word for Israel. Hence, I've put it in brackets here. That's the way we do things. The beginnings of the lines are cut off. We put them in brackets and dots in the translation, but we can read Lord of the sky, God of Israel. And then again, putting it into some Hebrew letters that you may recognize, Lord of the Sky, the God of Israel. There are dams in the region. Southern Arabia, by the way, if you know the Near East, if you know Israel, you know there's a rainy season in the winter, and it's typically dry the rest of the year. That's the way the agricultural system works. Southern Arabia is not tied to that meteorological system. It's Indian Ocean climate, so it has a monsoon season, just like we associate with the rest of the Indian Ocean, especially South Asia and Southeast Asia. And that's the way the climate works. And so when the monsoons come and deposit huge amounts of rain, the ancients already built dams, the largest of which was the Marib Dam, and it was restored by this king in the middle of the 5th century. And again, he says, with the aid and help of God, Ilahan, Lord of the sky and the earth, has to be obviously a Jewish king speaking in such fashion. Yusuf, as I said, expanded the kingdom northward to include Najran and Hima, which are here and here. This is the modern border between Saudi Arabia to the north and Yemen to the south. So we're now moving into this direction. The Jews of Yemen, Sana'a will become the capital, and it is the capital down to the present day. The Jews of Yemen, who you may know, most of them moved from Yemen to Israel. As far as I know, there are no Jews in Yemen left. We have some small numbers of Yemeni Jews in America. They were still living there in the 20th and perhaps into the 21st century. So the Jews that we know from our own society today, especially in Israel, would be the descendants of the community that I'm referring to here. In other words, there is no break in the history of Yemenite Jewry from the first few centuries CE, the kingdom of Himyar, through the rise of Islam down to the 20th and 21st centuries. And although you know of Jews in Yemen, I will tell you that into the 20th century, there was a Jewish community in Najran. As far as I know, it's the only Jewish community in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they're all gone today as well. They identified basically as Yemeni Jews, but they were living on the Saudi side of the border. If we go further north to Hima, you see it there again. This cliff face has an entire long inscription, a proclamation by the army general serving under that King Yusuf or Joseph. And you can read again, God to whom the sky and the earth belong, using expressions like Rahmanan and so on. Another inscription from the region referring to the Lord of the Jews. It's to the technical linguistic term, it's elided the yod. You would expect something like Rab Yahud, the Lord of the Jews. This would be the equivalent of Hebrew Rav, meaning Lord or Master. But it's the Hey Daled, the HD there is clearly the word for Jews, Yahud, Lord of the Jews with the praised one. And these just go and they continue on. I mean, we just have so many of these incredible inscriptions in the region. The last line there is where it says Lord of the Jews. Now, we probably should have known this all along, but nobody thought about it. And the reason we should have known about it all along is because of the following. Philostorgius was an early church historian. He wrote a work in Greek called Ecclesiastical History, and he's living up north in the Byzantine Empire in the Aegean region. He reported that there was a Christian missionary a generation before him, named Theophilus, who in the middle of the 4th century found many Jews living in Yemen. Now, we didn't think about it. Okay, there were Jews living in Yemen in the 4th century, so says Theophilus, as cited by Philostorgius. Well, it turns out that obviously it's true, right? So when the Himyar kingdom converted to Judaism in 380, as I said earlier, these must be the Jews that Theophilus had found there when he went off as a Christian mission trying to convert the polytheistic people of the region to Christianity. It's remarkable that all the lines of evidence converge so nicely for us. That's the Latin translation of that work and the first printing. This is a manuscript of the original Greek. It's dated to the 16th century. It's 1300 years after the composition in the British Library, and then this is the printed version in Latin, 1643. We have a synagogue dedication inscription. Their word for synagogue is mikrab, which means something like the place of prostration or the place of prayer. It's dated, we're back into the 4th century. It's prior to Himyar becoming a Jewish kingdom, right before they convert to Judaism. We have another synagogue inscription from slightly later. These are from various places in Yemen, as you can see. And that is the second part of that same inscription. And they read things like you see here, the names of all manner of individuals who established the synagogue with the date towards the bottom. And then it says, Shalom, Shalom. And in the last line, it says Mikrab Barik, right? Barik meaning blessed, but we don't think that it's an adjective, although it could be. There are no capital letters. We think probably it's the name of the synagogue. No different than synagogues get names today. It may be that it's actually the Barik synagogue or something like that. Okay, so giving you a sense of how we think about such things. We don't have a photo of it, but I have a line drawing of a Jewish cemetery dedication. Long inscription dedicating a cemetery. And it goes on in detail, and it refers to the fact that the Jews and the Gentiles, if you look at line 5 for a moment, that the Jews and the Gentiles need to be buried in separate places, which of course is typical of Jewish custom, right? So in line 4, to bury the Jews there with the guarantee that the burial of a Gentile next to them will be avoided. That doesn't mean a Christian, although it could be. It means anybody else, including the polytheists of the region. So it's quite a wonderful long inscription, and it's repeated in line 12 with avoid burying a Gentile on one of these plots. These are just photos of the general excavations of that town, Khasi, in southern Yemen. How do we know all this? How does Gary Rendsburg, how do I know any of this? I've never been to Yemen, but I read widely, and we are all indebted to the remarkable Christian Robin, a French scholar who is the world's expert on the history of Yemen and the kingdom of Himyar in particular. I assure you, I know Professor Robin, I assure you that he did not go to Yemen looking for Jews. He is not a historian of the Jews. He's a historian of the pre-Islamic Arabia. He didn't go looking for Jews, but he kept finding Jewish inscriptions everywhere, as you have seen. And he wrote 2 very long articles in French in 2003 and 2004, in which he talks about all of the evidence that I'm presenting to you. So I am taking all that remarkable work and distilling it for you in this 1-hour lecture so you get a sense of the richness of the material. He works mainly in Southern Arabia. The Northern Arabian material I've worked on more directly myself. And here's a picture of Professor Robin in situ in front of one of these, inscriptions. And I don't know who took this photo, but I love it because he's just got the enthusiasm hopefully comes through there. He finally wrote an article in English in 2021. So now I can assign this to my students, very few of whom can read French. The Judaism of the ancient kingdom of Himyar in Arabia, a discrete conversion. More material, an Aramaic seal, right? Everybody, you know what a seal is, right? You'd have to stamp something into clay, most likely, maybe somehow into parchment. But it's in Aramaic, and it says Yitzchak bar Chanina, clearly Jewish person. Remember that seals will be mirror image, so when you stamp it, you can actually see what it says. Very few of us get anything stamped anymore. I mean, libraries and post offices, they still have them, but everything gets scanned today. So this is the seal, but thank you to Photoshop, I can invert it for you, and you can actually now read it. So it says here, Yitzchak bar Chanina, Okay, this is what it actually looks like, but I finally figured out how to do this on Photoshop. I couldn't figure out why the coloration changed, but there you have it. Okay, a tomb inscription of somebody named Isaac. It starts out with his name, Yitzchak, as you see there in the upper right. A bilingual or almost trilingual inscription. It starts out in Aramaic. I'm going to read it for you. It shifts to Hebrew, and then it says basically the same thing in South Arabian. So if you want to follow along, Hada Kivurata Delea Brat Yehuda. This is in Aramaic. This is the tomb of Leah, the daughter of Yehuda. And then it shifts to Hebrew. Nishmatah l'chaye olam v'tanuach v'ta'amod l'gorah chaim l'ketz hayamin amen v'amen shalom. May she rest and may she stand, literally, but means arise, and may she arise at the appointed time or something like that at the end of days. I'm sorry. May she arise for the allotment of life at the end of days. Amen, amen, shalom. And then more or less the same thing said there in the Sabaic language in the South Arabian script. How many of you know about the Mishmarot? When the temple stood, the Jews divided the upkeep of the temple into 24 rotations, known in Hebrew as Mishmarot. This is an inscription from Yemen. We actually have an inscription like this from Caesarea, and we have other evidence of this in Jewish texts. But even the Jews of Yemen knew about the 24 priestly rotations of 24 different priestly families who rotated every 2 weeks in the upkeep of the temple. And they list them here. Only 9 of the, the inscription is broken, but 9 of the names that you see here appear in the Book of Chronicles. And we're talking a very long distance from the land of Israel, as I will show you. How many of you have been to Beit Sharim? Hands up. The great burial site of the same time period, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries in the Lower Galilee. The entranceway to the caves, there are about 20 or 25 different catacombs. Only a handful are open to the public. This is the main one. And you go in and you get these beautiful sarcophagi and niches. I'm sure many of you have been there. Absolutely wonderful sight. There is one of the catacombs, number 7, which is not open to the public. And I myself still have not been there. Last time I was there, I asked the staff member if I could get into catacomb number 7. He said it's just too dangerous. We are hoping to open up some more soon. As soon as it's safe, we're going to make them open to the public. I'm showing you this one because it's only old black and white photos available. On the archway that you barely see here on the top, it says in Greek, of the Chimyarites. If I change the coloring, you should be able to see it. Omeriton, meaning of the people of Chimyar. So this means that there was a special catacomb at Beit Sharim where the people of Chimyar would come and bury their dead. Now we are talking a distance of 2,600 kilometers. How they did this, did they go by camelback? Did they sail on the Red Sea? I mean, we simply don't know. But they had an attachment to the land of Israel to the extent that they, if you could afford it, would bury their dead at Beit Sharim alongside all the other prominent Jews, including rabbis whom we know from the Mishnah and the Talmud of the land of Israel. Obviously, there was a cemetery in Chimyar. I showed it to you, but the very wealthy or very devout presumably arranged for their burials in Beit Sharim. We end with Mecca and Medina. The geographical region we skipped over because we do not have any evidence for Jews in that region until of the sort that I have shown you. No inscriptions or anything like that I showed you. Stone inscriptions, none of that, until all of a sudden they're mentioned in the Quran in the 7th century. So Jews are mentioned about 100 times in the Quran, and specifically both in the city of Mecca and even more so in the city of Medina. And we even know the names of their tribes, not from the Quran, but later Muslim historians referred to these three Jewish tribes. Two of them were priestly. They're referred to in Arabic as al-Kahinan, meaning the priestly ones. And one of them is just, not dominated by priests. Again, we could have known this or should have known this all along. A great Muslim historian, Abu al-Faraj al-Isfahani, wrote a book called the Book of Songs. And we're now in the 10th century. He says that Jews arrived in the region in the wake of the Roman-Jewish wars. He doesn't go into the details of the first revolt and the second revolt and Jews moving to Tema and Jews moving to Yemen and so on and so forth. He just makes this generic statement. Now, how he knew this 700-800 years after the events, we don't know. But it turns out that he was correct. This is a precious independent testimony to, at a much later period, somebody looking back who recorded the fact that Jews had come there in the wake of the Roman-Jewish wars. And of course, the earliest dated text that I showed you is from about the year 200 CE. So there must have been Jews in the entire region. It is an absolutely remarkable story of the Jews in Arabia from the Great Revolt to the rise of Islam. I end my talks usually with Todah, but we can actually end this evening also with one Arabic word, which I've put here for you, shukran. Thank you very much, and happy, of course, to take questions.
Wonderful. This is so interesting. This is really material that even when we teach this, in a regular course, we barely have access to all those inscriptions. So this is very useful. My question to you about the first communities in Northern Arabia, I'm not clear, how did they manage to, what was the livelihood from?
Right. And that's a great question because we know Southern Arabia, as I talked about. They're relatively small populations. And I would say dates. There's palm trees, as you saw. So, dates would be number one part of the economy. Of course, there are dates all over Israel and Jordan. And, it's not like that would be specific, unlike Southern Arabia, where the myrrh and the frankincense is specific. You have, things, sheep and goats. And there's not a lot there. So that would be the basic economy. I'm thinking dates and sheep and goats.
Not trade. It's not that they were having caravan, that they could have been part of a much larger.
Well, no, they would have been on they would have been on the caravan route from the south of Arabia. So that's a good point, Chava, right? They would have been on the caravan route. The caravans would stop at these oases. They needed to. They needed to get water for themselves. Even camels eventually need water. So that would have been a part of their economy as well. You have an inn, you have a place where people can stay, and they buy food from you, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have questions, Lisa? Or I don't know if Gary, can you see the Q&A or not?
He can, but he
Yes.
Okay, so tell us what's in the Q&A.
Sure.
There's one in there. It says, beside the burial in Israel that you mentioned, is there other evidence that 4th century Arabian Jews communicated with any other Jews in the world?
Oh, great question. And I didn't show it. I had to exclude some material. There is a Jewish cemetery south of the Dead Sea in Jordan. It was actually shared by Jews and Christians. It's being excavated by a Greek archaeologist associated with the British Museum. And there are, again, probably hundreds of Jewish burials and hundreds, if not maybe thousands of Christian burials. So if you've been to Ain Bokek, if you've been to the hotels at the south of the Dead Sea, and you look across basically into Jordan, that's where you are. One of those inscriptions refers to a man from Chimyar. In other words, he didn't make it all the way to Beit Sharim, but he's buried there on that side of the Dead Sea, which is, more or less Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But even more so, I would think about the other side of the Red Sea. What are the roots of the Ethiopian Jewish community? And everyone agrees that the Ethiopian Jewish community must have been an offshoot, a very early offshoot of the Chimyar community or the Yemenite Jews in general. Can we date it back to the 4th century per the question? We think we have evidence for that, but one could imagine Jewish traders, men, crossing the Red Sea into Ethiopia, trading, staying there, marrying local Ethiopian women, and that would be the beginning of the Ethiopian Jewish community. But that's the most we can say at this time of history. I mean, there's, did they connect with the Jews in Babylonia, if you're asking, for example, at a later time, during the rise of Islam, when it was all part of the same caliphate? The answer is absolutely yes. But by the 4th century, in the 5th century and so on, probably limited to the land of Israel, northern Arabia, through the caravan routes, and probably Ethiopia.
Great, thank you. Next question is, it's obvious that Jews were in Arabia after the Roman wars, but it's amazing that it is so unheard of. Thank you for this lecture. The rise of Islam probably came about because of the Arabian Peninsula Jews, correct?
Correct. Also Christians. There were large Christian communities in Arabia. So the Quran refers to biblical figures both from the Jewish Bible and from the New Testament. So you get, Moses and Aaron and Jonah and Elijah, but you also get Mary and Jesus. So Muhammad learns of monotheism from both Jews and Christians. And both of those influence Islam. Clearly a major Jewish influence with the role of circumcision and the prohibition on pig, but also influence from Christianity because Jesus is seen as one of the the line of prophets, of which Muhammad is the culmination. So yes, there would have been a Jewish community, and there would have been Christians as well. So both of those religious traditions were present in Arabia in relatively large numbers.
Great, thank you. This is, I think, actually probably more pertinent to the last couple weeks that you did, but we'll still ask it. If there had been no revolts, would the Romans have allowed the Jews to remain in Israel?
I think undoubtedly yes. Romans had no problem with the Jews, right? Some of the Roman writers actually speak sympathetically about Jews, including Cicero. Some speak a little more pejoratively, including Tacitus, but they had no real problem with the Jews. Anybody could live within the Roman Empire. It was only the rebellions. So I think the answer to that is yes. Now, there already was a Jewish diaspora, as I talked about in my first talk, in Babylonia and in Egypt and places going back to the first temple, the destruction of the first temple. But it's pretty clear that, the Jews would have remained in the land of Israel, and the Romans wouldn't have, they would have let them be, as they'd let them be wherever they were in the Roman Empire. They never suppressed Jewish religion, right?
Right. Okay. This next one is actually a statement, but I think it will require more a comment from you as well. I thought that the Ethiopian Jewish community dated back to the time of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and their son Menelik, meaning from the king.
That's the Ethiopian Jewish lore. Not only the Ethiopian Jewish lore, it's the Ethiopian Christian lore, by the way. The kings of Ethiopia, Christian kings of Ethiopia, down to the last king, Haile Selassie, always saw themselves as the descendants of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. But that's only in the realm of lore. We definitely believe historically that the Queen of Sheba, visited Jerusalem. I mean, we don't have direct evidence for it, but we certainly have indirect evidence for the trade. We have evidence of the trade between Southern Arabia and Israel as early as the 10th century when Solomon was king. So it's perfectly feasible, and I suspect that it occurred that a monarch from that region visited Jerusalem. But the idea that their offspring became the founder of the Ethiopian dynasty or the progenitor of the Ethiopian Jewish community, that's just medieval lore. There's no historical value to that.
Okay. The next one is again a statement, but Solomon had boats go to India to get gold and other items for the temple construction.
Yes, that is correct. And which means they must have sailed, right by Yemen to do that. We do believe that this is historically accurate. The only footnote there is that Solomon is the one who is organizing it, but they were the Phoenicians. Remember, the Phoenicians were the great sailors, so they're the ones who actually sailed in a joint cooperative effort with the people of Israel to bring back spices like cinnamon and gold. Cinnamon is mentioned in the Bible, and cinnamon only comes from South Asia and Southeast Asia, nowhere else in the world. So to this day, all of our cinnamon comes from there. And some precious stones that are mentioned in the Bible come from South Asia as well. But it's so there's trade, but there's no Jewish communities in between. Yeah.
Is that just the Jewish communities that are in India now? Did they come from that time, or
most likely later? Well, the Sephardic ones, the real Sephardic ones, the Iraqi Jews who settled in Bombay or Mumbai and Calcutta, those are medieval. But the Jews of the southern part of India, Cochin and nearby places, would have been there relatively early, may also be an offshoot of these Yemeni Jews as well. I should have mentioned that. So I'm not 100% sure, and I don't know if anybody's 100% sure, but they may be related, the Jews of Cochin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question. I believe that there is a huge archaeological site on the far eastern Sinai on the Red Sea. It was a traditional trading post in the Common Era. Was it influenced by Jewish settlement?
I will have to say I'm not sure what archaeological site is being referred to, so I simply don't know how to answer. I don't think there are any huge archaeological sites in eastern Sinai. There may be little, ports or something along the Gulf of Eilat, but I've never explored that region, so I just don't know. I'll pass on that one.
The next one is, did Muhammad and his followers destroy the 3 Jewish Arabian tribes in the Mecca-Medina area?
Well, it's not. I don't know that. Again, I'm not an expert. Once you get to the rise of Islam, I leave the early Islamic period to others, and I don't know the answer to that. There were wars. I don't know if they were destroyed, and many of the Jews may have left and gone to Yemen, for example. So I don't know the answer to that question either, except to say that there were wars between these groups. But that's typical of all these Bedouin tribes. The internecine fighting is just ongoing, and I mean, not that they're Bedouin necessarily, but you still see internecine fighting throughout the Near East.
Okay. Is there any suggestion or evidence that any of these Jewish communities in Arabia predated the Roman revolts, or do we think they started as resettlement after leaving Israel?
We have no evidence for it. Could there have been a Jewish trader, a Jewish this, a Jewish that in these places? Possible. But the earliest evidence is that inscription from the year 203, with the inference that his parents or grandparents had been the ones who came to the region sometime in the 2nd century CE. I will say that the Bible does refer to these oasis sites. The Bible refers to Tema, and the Bible refers to some of these other sites. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze here for a minute. Sorry. But the other peoples are living there. It just means they're within the geographical horizons of the people of Israel. It's not that there were Jews living there, but they knew about these places. So again, probably caravan traders we keep going back to the spice trade. So, but most likely no Jews there until they needed to go there, certainly on a permanent basis after the Roman Jewish wars.
Okay, last few questions here. If there were no Jews in Mecca and Medina, why are there over 100 mentions of Jews in the Quran?
Oh no, let me make it clear. There were Jews, we just don't have stone inscriptions.
Got it. Okay.
In other words, clearly there were Jews, they're referred to everywhere, but for whatever reason, there just aren't archaeology is random. One day will we find some rock cliffs or somebody will go out and explore and find inscriptions in the region. Mecca and Medina are still, inhabited cities to this day. That makes archaeology difficult, right? The sites I showed you generally are not inhabited, especially the ones in Yemen. So you can excavate.
Okay, last question, unless Hava wants to ask one after. Were these Jews Hellenized or, and if so, what was the evidence of that?
Well, I mean, the Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean were Hellenized in the sense that they spoke Greek, and the Jews of Alexandria, Egypt, being the largest such center. I would say probably not. They're not using Greek. They're using Hebrew, Aramaic, and the language of Arabia, either north, these like Nabatean Aramaic in the north, or Sabaic, South Arabian in the south. No evidence that they're really Hellenized in the sense that you might think of. Yeah.
Okay. Hava?
Yes, so a follow-up on this last question would be, what do you think, how did these Jews identify themselves culturally, or what was their religious expression? What do you think, what was their Judaism, quote unquote, like?
Yeah, Christian Robin has written on this. They have a synagogue, but with all of these inscriptions, we may have one that uses the word Rav, rabbi. But even that may not be a rabbi like you and I think of a rabbi. It may simply mean Rav in the sense of master. So we just don't know enough about their Jewish tradition, right? Other than they took care to bury separately from Gentiles. They had a synagogue. They had an attachment to the land of Israel, right? All of those things you can see. But whether they were of the rabbinic type Jews or what we'll call non-rabbinic, independent, simply Am Yisrael type Jews, which is probably what they were, we simply don't know for sure.
What kind of text might they have in terms of biblical text?
Wouldn't we love to know that, right?
Yeah.
Look, they must have had a Torah. They must have had biblical books, right? The only evidence for rabbinic Judaism in the Arabian Peninsula is, remarkably, the Quran actually cites the Mishnah once. Now, it doesn't say it's citing the Mishnah. It just says something. It's a passage. It's a passage that we know from the Mishnah, which was 400 years older. It's been recently treated by my colleague Aaron Kohler of Yeshiva University. That would be the only evidence for anything specifically rabbinic in that region. It goes without saying we don't know about their diet. It doesn't matter. There are no pigs in the region anyways, all right? Pigs don't live in the desert. So everybody would have been eating just sheep and goats if they ate meat. These are questions that are, great questions, and these inscriptions are wonderful, but we just don't get the information that we would love to know. We don't have a Philo, telling us about the Jewish life like he does in Alexandria, Egypt. We just don't have any of that. Right?
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, if we don't have any more questions on the chat or the Q&A, I will remind everyone that next week on the, December 11th, Noah Feldman is going to be with us, and he's going to focus on the challenges for contemporary Jews, how to be a Jew today. Basically, that's the title of his latest book that came out just last year. So I hope to see you all also next week. And thanks again, Professor Rendsburg, for this enlightening lecture. And it's absolutely fascinating.
It's been so wonderful to be together for these 3 evenings, once in person and twice on Zoom. So thank you again, Chava. I'm
My
waving
pleasure.
to you, Lisa. Thank you also, Lisa.
All
And thank
right.
you, everyone.
Yes.